Would you like to play some football?
And welcome to another edition, a college football playoff edition of Gridiron and the Gospel of Faith in College Football podcast. The first round of the college football playoffs, the home sites, the first time we've ever had home fields advantage, I guess is what it was in the playoff, is in the books. And my name is George Schroeder.
I'm Brad Edwards. And George, there really there's not a whole lot to talk about as far as what happened on the field during the games. But that didn't stop there being a whole lot of people who wanted to talk about it while the games were going on. And we'll get into some of that. I don't even know if it really is controversy, but there was a lot of discussion.
No, it's not. You're talking about what used to be known as Twitter. So Paul Putz, Dr. Paul Putz, who is director of the Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor's George W. Truett Theological Seminary, joins us. He's a friend of the pod. And Paul, thank you for joining us too. I should have introduced you right off the top too, but we appreciate you joining us. And that's why the picture, if you happen to watch us on YouTube, looks a lot better right now because he's got his new office set up on the, the third floor?
Third floor. That's right. That's right. Moved up to the third floor. Yeah. Thanks, George and Brad. Great to be with you. I think we talked last year, and just love what you guys are doing. So really thankful for the invite.
You were one of the first guests that we had. I don't think you were the first, but you were one of the first three, I believe.
Yeah, I'll take it early on.
And you didn't get shunned for doing it. It's still going strong, so that's good.
Well, he did, but he's not telling anybody this time, so it works out.
Yeah.
No, well, and so we have to get all the sort of the dirty laundry out in early, but you are a Cornhuskers fan, grew up in Nebraska, and so they're doing something that they used to do quite often, but they haven't done in a while now. They're going bowling this postseason, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I do, before we get into the playoffs, I do want to ask you this. As a long-suffering Huskers fan, is this season great? Is it relief? What is it? I mean, I think early it started out like it was going to go pretty easy. Okay, Matt Rule's going to get them going. And the next thing you know, you're eking it out. And what was it like as a Huskers fan?
Yeah, I think it was a mix of all of that. I mean, we had the Colorado game. We come out, we dominate, and we're feeling great. Dylan Raiola, our freshman quarterback, is awesome. And then we just lost a close one to Illinois, got blown out by Indiana, and it felt like more of the same with Nebraska with one score losses. It doesn't matter who the coach is. You can go back to Bill Callahan, Mike Riley, and of course, Scott Frost, continue with Matt Rule. And that's been an issue. So 6-6 going to a bowl game feels like progress, but the way the season ended against Iowa, losing in devastating fashion, that felt like a setback. So us Cornhusker fans, we're kind of a mix of all of it. We glad to have a bowl game, but still don't feel like the team reached its potential. Still, we're in the postseason. We're playing. We're getting practices in. And one thing about the Cornhuskers, we always declare ourselves the off-season national champs. So the fan base, we're rallying. We're getting transfers in. We're already setting our sights on next year. Dana Holgerson is in as the offensive coordinator. So we're fired up, ready to go for next year, like always.
Paul,
I actually think that's a big deal. Dana Holgerson can be hit or miss as a head coach, but he really knows how to dial up an offense, and that could be really helpful, I think, to the Huskers. So good deal. I'm sorry, Brad, I ran over.
Yeah,
you.
No, Paul, I was gonna say there's a radio show that I go on in Nebraska fairly regularly, and one of the things that I used to say several years ago is that from a Nebraska fan standpoint, I mean, sure, you want to be where Ohio State is, where Michigan has been in recent years, because that's the history of the program. But at the very least, you say, and this was, 5 or so years ago, we should be able to do what Wisconsin is doing, right? Like, it's not like Wisconsin has more talent. And so projecting that to this year and the playoff, which we're about to get into, there's no reason that Nebraska can't be as good as Indiana or SMU, some of the teams that we just saw play. Now, it didn't go too well, and we're going to get into that. But just as a college football fan, what were your overall impressions of the first round of the playoff?
Well, I think you're right. It feels like Nebraska can get in one of those back slots, right? It feels like we're not that far off from having a run, and maybe we're the 12th, 11th, 10th team in there. So that feels different. That feels new. Watching the games, I'm not an SEC fan. I'm from the Midwest, Big Ten guy, Nebraska guy, and now Big 12 guy with Baylor. And so, of course, we don't have a lot of love for the SEC. I know you got a lot of SEC listeners. So this is just, it's football. It's nothing personal. So early on,
always
always personal. That's right. But it was hard early on watching some of those results come in, and you're seeing Indiana, get dominated, and the calls to have Alabama be the team that should have been in. And we see the struggles with SMU. But I think it's just a good reminder to have some perspective, right? I mean, I think we're so quick to jump on a narrative that fits whatever side or conference we root for. If we would have let all the games play out, we would have seen Ohio State come in and dominate this SEC team. Then maybe we could have had like a more balanced conversation thinking about the dynamics of the CFP.
Well,
but
the order of the games had been different, right? If that had been the Friday night game instead of the Saturday night game,
100%.
It would have changed the conversation immensely.
100%. So no good games, right? But there's lots of back and forth happening on X, formerly known as Twitter. And I do think it is ridiculous that Boise State is waiting, with the bye. So they need to get the seeding figured out. I think if you fix the seeding, then we can have matchups that make more sense. And then I feel better about the new format.
Yeah, I look at it. Sorry, George. I look at it, and there are obviously a lot of mismatches, a lot of lopsided scores in the 4-team playoff. Most of the semifinals were not competitive. A lot of the championship games, even though on paper some of them should have been close, they weren't in all that much doubt going into the fourth quarter and throughout the fourth quarter. So this is kind of normal for the college football playoff. I feel like what people lost sight of is that because of the way that they did the seeding and the numbers that you're seeing to the left of the teams, what we actually had was the teams that were ranked 3, 4, 5, and 6 playing on their home fields in this round. And again, and when they're not playing against 1 or 2, it's very understandable that those would not be all that competitive given everything else that was involved. Look, I think you see those results, and it's hard to say that if it had been on a neutral field, it would have been any different. But I think the one thing, for all the disagreement, the one thing that everybody agreed on is that it was really cool to see postseason games played on campus, and to have that type of environment instead of that stale, dome, neutral site type of feel that we often get. And so that was my biggest takeaway, was that made it fun to watch. And the 4 teams that are seeded 1 through 4, I think they're getting a raw deal by not being able to play at home. Now, you could argue, do 3 and 4 deserve to be hosting the teams that they're playing? That's a completely different story. But if you're going to say you earned those top 4 spots, you should get to play at home too, because that was awesome. And, the teams that got to win a home game to get there, now, in theory, they should have to go on the road and see what it's like to be on the other side of it.
Yeah, I like that. Also, one quick thought on Brad, what you were saying with the home field advantage, the sarcastic SEC chant that broke out, Buckeyes, that's beautiful, right? The game's out of hand, but even that, the whole narrative that's playing out, you saw some sense of, like, we can't call it regional rivalry because these conferences stretch coast to coast now, but there's some sort of rivalry you identify with your conference now. So even if your team's not in it, I'm watching on TV, I'm hearing the SEC chant, I'm getting fired up about it. So, that part of it was kind of cool to see.
Yep. I just want to let you guys know, all of our listeners, that's Paul Putz. He's the one that's saying that stuff about the SEC. We would never do that.
Send all your hate mail to me.
Yes, exactly.
The funny thing is, I think most of the fans in the SEC were rooting against Tennessee.
I don't, and I'll tell you why. Because
they hate Ohio State worse?
Well, no, because there's a narrative that gets attached to the SEC. And listen, this is where you guys will all start directing your hate to me. But you attach yourselves, even if your team didn't make the playoff, you attach yourselves to the others because it sort of elevates the league if they do well, and sort of continues and fosters the narrative. So, but I hear what you're saying. I will say this, the way Ohio State just put it on Tennessee quieted that talk that you were talking about. And look, largely what we're talking about is the kind of thing that's playing out on social media, and also it's playing out really on ESPN in a lot of ways with just sort of initial reaction. And what happens is, here's my initial reaction to this game, to SMU, to Indiana, to not so much to Clemson. They played a credible game, but Texas was clearly better, especially in Austin. The reaction to that was, there was some, man, we really maybe should have had these other teams in the playoff, which I would disagree with completely on the merits, first of all. But secondly, regardless of that, when Ohio State put it on Tennessee, there was a lot of silence, at least on social media. Lane Kiffin hasn't rediscovered the tweeting thumbs. Now he'll rally because he is a master of tweeting or posting on X. But you're not going to, suddenly it sort of cut the legs out from underneath that narrative. And so I do think the rest of the country, it's not like Ohio State has a fan base that a lot of people like. Okay. Ohio State has one of those fan bases that feels pretty entitled. I mean, go figure how they're handling the Ryan Day situation, right? But I think there were probably a lot of people around the country, if you didn't have a dog in the fight, were probably enjoying seeing Ohio State do that to Tennessee. And I don't have anything against Tennessee or for Ohio State, but I think just in general, that was sort of the sense I got. Even though I'm out of the business now, I sometimes can't help but just kind of watch the Twitter feed or the X feed scroll and just see what people are saying. And it's a bad habit, and at some point I got to get rid of it, but I don't know when. But it was fascinating to watch. I alluded to something. I want to ask both you guys this. Regardless of the Ohio State kind of turning the narrative around a little bit with how they blew out Tennessee, do you believe that there is merit to the idea that Indiana and SMU didn't deserve to be in the playoff? That idea that was floating through the air Friday night and Saturday during the afternoon.
So I will say there is merit to it. I don't think that they deserve to be in the playoff, and I don't think Alabama or Ole Miss deserve to be in the playoff either. I don't think there were 12 teams that deserve to be in the playoff. And we discussed this a few weeks ago, George. But the problem is, if you're the selection committee, your job's to put 12 teams in. And so some teams that had not earned it through going out and beating a few quality opponents and at the same time not losing very many games along the way, there weren't 12 of those resumes. And so that's what we got. And look, as much as you might be able to say, and it may or may not be true, that let's just say Alabama would not have been embarrassed the way that some of the other teams were. The truth is, Alabama was embarrassed by Oklahoma, which is nothing close to a playoff team.
The worst Oklahoma team probably in a quarter century.
So it's not like Alabama isn't capable of being embarrassed, but even if you were to say that, okay, so Alabama's not going to go in there and get physically dominated at the line of scrimmage the way that Indiana did. Okay, that may be true, but I can look at what Alabama did this season and I can say, I don't think Indiana would have lost at Vanderbilt. I don't think Indiana would have lost at Oklahoma. If you look at their scores in most of the games they played this season, they were pretty good, and they took care of teams like that. They might not have beaten any really good teams, but when they played that caliber team, they took care of business. So do I think Alabama would beat Indiana 8 times out of 10? I don't. Not this year's 2 teams. And so, yeah, to answer your question, I think there are a whole lot of teams that didn't deserve to be in the playoff. Some of them got in, some of them didn't.
That's at J. Brad Edwards on Twitter. Yep. At J. Brad Edwards. Paul, what do you think about that?
Probably similar. You have to pick 12. You're going to have deeply flawed teams coming in in those last large slots. I mean, that's just the way it is. I think everything you mentioned, I'd amen that. I mean, with Alabama, you can make a case. You can put their resume. I think it's fair to make a case for them being in, but I do think if you're just looking at resumes, what happened over the course of the year, they're all deeply flawed. I felt all right about the 12 teams that were in. I didn't think that after they're in, then that's, how they do against the team they play is going to justify whether or not they should have been in. If we have 12 teams, it is what it is. I am going to be curious, like if we compare college football to the NFL, as college football moves more in this kind of super league direction, will we have the type of parity where you could have a team that comes in at the 8, 9, 10, make a run and they like kind of where you never know? Because the NFL,
I think so.
You never really know, right? You can have a sense of who the favorite is, but there's always some 9-7 Giants team or Ravens team that makes a run and wins it all. It feels like college football, we haven't had a mechanism for that to happen really. And will this open up the chance for that? I don't think we're there yet, but maybe down the road we
Well,
could end up being there.
I'll tell you how I think it could happen. And Brad, I know you'd like to chime in probably on this. Here's how it could happen. If you have a team that first of all, there's a little getting hot and avoiding injuries. And then some of these teams that are super talented, none of them are deep like they were 2 and 3 and 5 years ago, because all their backups who were sitting there waiting to play have transferred away to play immediately and to make a lot of money, and good for them. But it means that depth is there's parity everywhere, and then there's less depth at the top. So then if you add in an injury to a Carson Beck, not that Carson Beck had played like a world beater, for example, but an injury to someone like that, if the Ohio State quarterback went down, if Dylan Gabriel went down, and look, boy, we sure hope that doesn't happen, obviously. And so then that, all of a sudden the dynamic quarterback is gone. All of a sudden, that's how one of these teams that you're talking about from a 8, 9, 10 slot slides in. I could easily see that. I could see, I don't believe this will happen this year, but I could see, especially if they don't change the way the seeding is set up with the automatic qualifiers getting a bye, and I do think they're going to change that. But if I could see where a Boise State having to run one less game would have a chance one day, which would be kind of the ultimate Cinderella thing. Now, is that going to happen? I don't think so, but I could see it. Brad, I know you've got thoughts. In the past, that would have been unthinkable. I think it's at least thinkable.
Yeah, well, look, like you said, the seeding is part of this, which is that Ohio State, Tennessee on paper was an 8-9 game. Both of those teams were actually ranked higher than that. So it wasn't really.
Go by the rankings for a second, like what the rankings were, the CFP rankings before they slotted them. Could some of those teams have done it?
When you're talking about teams in the back end, I agree with what you were saying for part of it, George, which is that it's going to take a situation where a team that has a lot of talent, for whatever reason, loses a couple of games and then gets it figured out and then kind of gets hot toward the end of the season and they barely get in. See, I think if someone is going to make a run from the back end of the bracket where they're going to have to win 4 games to win it all. If someone's going to do that to win the whole thing, I think it's going to be a team that recruits at a top 10 level, because ultimately this game is won at the line of scrimmage. You can pull one upset when you're not as good in the trenches as somebody else, but to win week after week with the competition at that level, if you're not as good in the trenches, I just don't think it's going to happen. And so if there's going to be a unexpected run, I don't think it's going to be a team that you would call Cinderella, even though their seeding might say they are. It's going to be someone that's got a lot of 4- and 5-star players and just happen through whatever circumstances to end up barely getting into the field. And, that's how I see it. I do not see there being a Boise State being the team that's making that run.
Or an SMU.
Or an SMU.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, this year's SMU or TCU anything, from a couple of years ago. Might have won a game, but wasn't going to win 4.
Right. And there could be a scenario where you end up with, and it's so hard to see this the way that everything is going today with NIL and transfers and all that. But maybe you could end up with a team that has a very experienced roster, right? Let's say that a lot of juniors and seniors throughout the roster, throughout the 2 deep. For whatever reason, out of conference, they lose a couple of games early, then they make a run through the league. I can see a team like that has a lot of experience, great chemistry. Maybe they could do it, but I still think more than likely it's going to be a team that's just got top recruits and a lot of NFL prospects.
The prerequisite is to have a dynamic quarterback.
Yeah.
If you've just got, and that's the thing about this particular field, is there's Dylan Gabriel and who? I mean, and so, but if you had that, and people thought, well, maybe Kevin Jennings can do that for SMU, and he had a terrible game. He had a great year, terrible game. But you have to have that guy to go with the kind of team you're talking about to pull it off from a non-sort of traditional or non-recruiting powerhouse type of team, probably.
Yeah. And you think about some of the teams that have been dominant in recent years. Now, Stetson Bennett aside, Stetson Bennett is kind of the exception to this. But a lot of these teams that, whether it was an Alabama team or Clemson, Ohio State, you get some of these teams that are loaded with talent, and then they have one of the top quarterbacks along with it. Okay. I was thinking about the playoff field and who the quarterbacks are going in and the number of them who are transfers and where they transferred from. So Dylan Gabriel started off at UCF when UCF was in the American. Like he was recruited or overlooked as a recruit to the point he signed with a Group of 5 program. And
it's back in the 20th century, I think. When
right, yeah, however long ago that was. Will Howard came from Kansas State, Power 4 program, but not a team that recruits at a high level. I don't know what his recruiting profile was, but I'm guessing he wasn't sought after by almost everybody. Some of the others, like Curtis Rourke at Indiana was, from Ohio. Who I'm trying to think, there was another one. Well, actually, no. Kevin Jennings was a very lightly recruited player who went to SMU. He wasn't a transfer though. There was another transfer, and I'm trying to think of who it was. It was from another program or had a recruiting. It was Riley Leonard. Mm-hmm. Riley Leonard went to Duke, yep. Right? And so a lot of these guys who are starring are not. You don't have many of those Nico Iamaleavas at Tennessee who were all everything. Everybody wanted them out of high school. Most of these guys were kind of overlooked. And look, sometimes those guys end up being great NFL quarterbacks. We've seen plenty of guys who were lightly recruited out of high school that ended up being great quarterbacks, not only at the college level, but at the pro level as well. But in general, those are not the guys that end up leading a playoff run in college. But maybe there will come a day where that happens. It just depends on how long this format lasts, and give it long enough. And I'm sure one of these days, if a program like that can hold on to that guy. Like, in other words, Riley Leonard, if he stays at Duke, could a Duke make a run? Or is it inevitable that if a guy shows talent at a place like that, he's going to end up at Notre Dame?
Can I just say, and I shouldn't say this, I'm a Nebraska fan. Boy, it would be fun to see Colorado in the CFP. Wouldn't that be fun? You have dynamic quarterback play. You got the Heisman Trophy winner. And I know that they didn't earn a spot. Obviously, there was a reason they didn't get in. But man, if they could have been on the cusp, maybe that Arizona State slot, I would have loved to see, and the eyeballs on it, there already are a lot, but to have Coach Prime involved. But and you talk about dynamic quarterback play, there's one who would stand out, and maybe they win one, maybe they make things interesting. They probably aren't going all the way, but I would have loved to see that.
Yeah,
their lines are not very good. They're better than they were a year ago. Shador, and it's not just Travis Hunter. Obviously, he's really good as a corner, but he's really good as a wide receiver. They've got a bunch of receivers who are difference makers. And I was thinking that earlier. It would have been fun to see Colorado in the playoff. They're not good enough, but they'd have been one that could have caused some trouble on a road game somewhere. Hey, let me flip one thing to the road games. We talked about the road, talked about these home playoff games. That's what makes college football great to me, is the home campus environments. And it's not that I dislike bowl sites or the playoff venues or whatever that we've seen in the past, but injecting the home field element, even in December, even in late December, I guess mid to late December, when the students have gone home, they all came back basically, right? It made it different. It made it better. It made it feel like that be all end all game that we used to think about in late November, only magnified on steroids. And the games didn't play out that way, but just the pageantry and the hype around it and the feeling. I mean, the first playoff game on a campus site is at Notre Dame Stadium. I mean, come on, they couldn't have dreamed that up any better. The only thing he could have dreamed up better would have been if this was WWE, they'd have had it a little bit more competitive, right? That's amazing. That's what this is about. And I hear what y'all are saying too about the next thing we're going to say is, why is Ohio State going to the Rose Bowl to play Oregon? Why aren't they going back to Autzen Stadium as the lower seeded team to play Oregon? Why does Oregon not get to have a home game? I understand that. I love the Rose Bowl. I love the bowl games, especially the big ones. So I don't want to lose them. But I understand that argument, which is they got to play a home game. Yeah, they got to play an extra game, but they got to play a home game. The four teams with the byes don't get home games. Now, nobody's upset about playing in the Rose Bowl. I'm just going to tell you. But still, you're right. Why shouldn't you get a home game at this point? That's what's amazing. And one other thing about that. For years, what have we heard from our friends from the northern climes, like Paul? We've heard if we could just get you guys up in the cold elements, as they talk to their southern friends, it would go different. Well, we didn't have very many of those true sort of southern teams go up there. Tennessee goes up to Columbus and it was cold. Don't get me wrong, but it's not like Knoxville is Miami Beach, right? We didn't get a lot of those, but it was still, you still got at least a taste of what it's like to play out in the elements in the wintertime in the north, and that was cool too.
Oh, if we got a snow game in the CFP, and you have Georgia coming in, playing some. Georgia just got me excited. You got me excited thinking about this. Yeah.
Well, it's going to happen. Inevitably, it's going to happen at some point. So
yeah. So look, for those who don't know, the reason that that's not happening this year or next year is because there were still 2 years left on the contract that had been signed that included the New Year's 6 games, and they had to find a way to make sure that the sites, the bowl sites that were due to host semifinals this season and next season still got to do that according to the contract. And then the other 4 bowl games, they didn't want to give them duds, so they gave them quarterfinals. But I think the big test is this, and I think we all know exactly how this is going to go, is that when the next deal is done, will they put quarterfinals on campus sites, or will the powers that be in college football continue to, I was going to say bow down to, I don't know if that's necessarily the right way to say it, but will they continue to support the bowls in a way that is not necessary? Look, I love bowl games. They have been a big part of college football history, and I've had a lot of fun watching them throughout my lifetime. But the truth is that at this stage, given where the power lies, the conferences hold all the power. They don't need the bowls anymore, and especially not with this format. So why are they insisting on sharing revenue with bowl games when they could keep it for themselves? And look, I mean, you could say that sounds greedy, and it is, but the reality is, with all the stuff that's going on right now, they need more money. I mean, all of these schools would love to have more money, and one way to get it is to just cut the bowls out of it, or at least for the quarterfinal round. If you want to keep them doing semis and championship, that's fun, or that's fine and all that. But I think the fun way to go, and the most practical economically, is to now own the quarterfinals once we get to the 2026 season. And let's see the teams that win at home in the first round then have to go on the road in the next round.
Yeah. So listen, first of all, hush your mouth, Brad.
Talking about the bowls.
Yeah, talking about the bowls like that. Now, but as you moved along, I thought, well, maybe he's not talking about the semis could still be bowl games. I'd be okay with that. And I think semis and the finals and the final would make sense. But that's only 3 bowls, right? If you use the final as a bowl game, which it currently isn't. Bowls are a part of the fabric of college football. And if there's one thing we've seen shredded over the last few years, it's the fabric of the game. Moving those games to home sites sort of shows that, sort of puts it back in. That's part of the campus environment, is part of the fabric of the game. So that's a good thing. But bowls have been a huge, huge part of college football. And we're talking about the big bowls. We're not talking about the ReliaQuest Bowl. Okay. No offense, good ReliaQuest friends. I don't know what you are, but great. We're not talking about those bowl games. We're talking about the orange and the cotton and the rose and the sugar and the Fiesta and the peach. We're talking about those games. The Pac-12 is, disintegrates, and part of college football is shredded. And that's just part of the tapestry that college football is. I don't know if what you're saying is inevitable. It might be, but I hope somehow that those large, I don't know what the fate is of the small bowls. Maybe they'll stick around and they're going to find revenue sharing and induce some players to want to play and some things like that. But I'm hoping that those big bowl games still remain a part of college football somehow. I don't know how, but that's just my hope. And I don't know if that makes me an old fuddy-duddy or not. I don't know. But I love college football, and that's part of the fabric of it to me. Paul, what do you think?
It is part of the fabric. It's also it's been in flux since we kind of moved into some postseason when we had the 4-team playoff. And I would lean towards in the semifinals with the 4 teams. Let's rotate the big bowls. Orange, rose, sugar. Cotton. You mentioned peach, Fiesta. Some mix of those. I mean, to me, rose and orange and sugar are non-negotiables, and then we'll see what the others are in the mix there. Rotate those in terms of those 3 games that you talked about, semifinals and final. And then I think with the other bowl games, they can still they'd have other teams, kind of the best of the teams that aren't in the top 12. They're still happening every year, and then every couple of years they get a CFP game. I think I'd lean towards that, and then have the extra home games for that quarterfinal round. Because I think you're exactly right. That, to me, a chance for a campus to showcase what it's all about. You're talking about traditions that could be emphasized, games that we really won't see happen as much anymore. The way that all these teams and leagues are talking about, scheduling tough non-conference teams and how they aren't going to do it anymore. The CFP will probably be the chance where we can see those matchups, and I'd love to see those take place on campus if we can. So I think that's how I probably balance it. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm a historian, so I do. There's just something about the history, the tradition, the pageantry that I wouldn't want to lose, for sure.
Yeah, look, to me, part of the bowl experience was always going there, 5-6 days in advance, being part of a lot of activities leading up to the game. And when it's part of a playoff structure, you don't get that anymore, because it's no longer like a trip that's a reward for a great season. This is a business trip. I mean, this is a game with a national championship on the line, and you're not going there to sightsee and do all those things. And so I think part of what made the bowl experience a lot of fun is already gone for the bowls that are part of the playoff structure. And so I don't think it would be as big of a deal as it might feel like to other people to get rid of that, because I don't think the players and coaches are getting the same bowl experience that the teams in the past got.
I do is there a way to incentivize it, right? Can you and I don't know, you'd have to get real creative, maybe it's even like you're competing for like conference versus conference for a chance to get like a certain amount of money that the most bowl wins for your particular conference, or bowl percentage, because some teams would have more than others, get some big reward that goes into the pot that the school share. I don't know how you do it, but if there's a way to incentivize those games mattering a little bit, I'd love to see that. And hopefully people much smarter than me are thinking of ways to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I could see that.
Yeah, I think there are people looking at ways to do that. I mean, we could get, this is like an off-season conversation too, but one of the things that I think would be interesting would be, as the playoff expands, and it's probably inevitable, it's going to go to 14, and not next year, but probably the year after that, because to go back to the very beginning, because even though they don't deserve it, we're going to add in some of these teams that didn't quite get there. And then they're going to lose in the same fashion that we saw yesterday. And we record this on Sunday nights most of the time. So we're talking about the Friday and Saturday games. But inevitably, as it expands, you're going to have teams lose in on the second weekend of December instead of probably the third weekend of December. And my question is there any appetite ever to place a loser of one of those games in a bowl game? And I don't know that there is, but I think, because otherwise, how are you going to get someone that's representative into a bigger, what we would say a better bowl game, if they're all in the playoff structure and then some of them get cast out pretty quickly? That's a question.
To me, that's a tough sell. When your season has basically ended, I mean, that would be like, okay, if a team, I was going to say it would be like if a team loses in the first round of the NCAA basketball tournament and then you just seed them into the Sweet 16 of the NIT. But even that, that's not the best comparison, because even with the NIT, you're still playing for a trophy. You're still playing for a championship of some sort. Whereas if you're just going to a bowl game that really is just a glorified exhibition game, I don't know what your motivation is to go out there and want to play that after you've just been eliminated from the national championship competition.
I could see fewer bowl games being okay as well. I mean, I think maybe it's the case that just 6 wins and my Nebraska Cornhuskers maybe don't get in with a 500 record. If you maybe make it a reward that means a little bit more, it's recognition of a good season. Again, thinking through the incentives like we talked about, maybe it's some money invested in the players. There's got to be some other ways to incentivize that. But I agree. I think it is so central to college football that to think of not having bowl games, For me, I can't even imagine college football without them in some form. And so I'd love to see that. I will say with Nebraska you mentioned before, I think, Brad, you mentioned this, how the bowl game is about all this stuff along with the game. Reading about the Cornhuskers, it's the first time in 7 years they're going. And so they're talking about going to Central Park. They're in the Pinstripe Bowl. They're talking about, players texting each other and, hey, what are we gonna check out when we're in New York City? And Matt Rule is flying in all of last year's seniors. So, there's some alumni connection to the game. So that it feels like that's what the bowl games should be about. It's about a school and a team and one last chance to be together. And yeah, you're going to go out and try to win the game, but there's all this other stuff that is really beautiful. And I think one of the best things about sport, even if you're not quote unquote playing for the championship, it doesn't mean there's not something meaningful that can happen. And I think there's ways to get at that, maybe cutting some bowl games out, but there's got to be a way to find a path forward.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be interesting. Before we move forward, let me go back to this weekend we just had, the first round games, 4 games all on campus sites. I think I know the answer to this one. Well, I'm going to ask 2 questions. 1, who was most impressive? And 2, how many of the winners, Penn State, Texas, Ohio State, Notre Dame, could win the national championship after what you saw this weekend, when all 4 of them were impressive in different ways? Penn State now plays Boise State in the Fiesta. Texas plays Arizona State in the Peach. Ohio State versus Oregon in the Rose Bowl. I can't wait to see that one. It's a rematch of a game in Autzen Stadium in Eugene. And then Notre Dame, Georgia in the Sugar. But of those teams, which was most impressive, and how many of them, I'm not asking which one, but how many of them could win the national championship based on what you saw last couple of days? Thoughts?
Go for it, Paul.
It's interesting because I think Ohio State was most impressive, and yet they probably have the hardest path to winning the national championship because they have to go through Oregon. So they looked like the team people expected them to be with the roster they had, the NIL and the transfers they're bringing in. And maybe they turned a corner, have kind of bottoming out with that loss to Michigan. And sometimes when you hit that bottom, you kind of rally together. And I'd love to see Ohio State make a run. Not a Buckeyes fan, but I love a good redemption story. So, Ohio State I'll put as most impressive, but not necessarily most likely. In terms of like how many could win, honestly, of all 4 of them, I wouldn't be like wildly shocked. Notre Dame probably is the team where in Penn State to some degree, because Penn State's never really beat an elite team in recent years. So it'd be a surprise bit to see Penn State or Notre Dame. But if things, ball bounces the right way, there's a lot of turnovers. Penn State has a type of defense they can stick around, and they're playing the easiest team next. So I can see a path for Penn State to get through there. And Texas certainly is a team everyone expected them to be in the mix when they're coming into this. So I could see them, and Notre Dame too. Georgia without their starting quarterback, maybe they pull off a win there, and then you see what happens. So I really could see a path for all 4 teams, but clearly Ohio State and Texas, to me, they're the ones who are kind of no-brainers, that they're demonstrating the talent level to get it done.
Yeah, I would agree with your assessment of Ohio State being the most impressive team. And George, you and I were talking about this throughout the season, is that so many of the top teams, the most talented teams, were just inconsistent. And you looked at some of these teams were going to end up having to play in this first round. And regardless of talent, you just ask, based on what we've seen from Ohio State this year, is it realistic to think that they could win 4 games in a row against top 10 caliber of competition? Because it's one thing to do it once, right? Like you look at the scenario, at the setup going into the game where, first of all, you had the embarrassment of the Michigan loss. Then you had all the people calling for Ryan Day's job. And there was a lot to rally around. And then on top of it, Tennessee ends up, I don't know what percentage it ended up being as far as the crowd, but somehow they got all these tickets and they end up where they've got a decent portion of the crowd there. And everything just kind of aligned for Ohio State to be, okay, it's us against the world, which everybody loves to kind of paint themselves in that position to begin with. But for Ohio State, they had a lot of reasons to kind of rally and to be ultra focused and to play their best game, and they did it. And like you said, this is the team everybody expected to see. This is the team that had very few holes going into last offseason, and the ones they did have, they went out and they grabbed players out of the portal to plug those holes, and they paid them a lot of money. And this was a team that was put together specifically to win a national championship. And that's what we saw on Saturday
And to
night.
beat
We saw
Michigan.
that team. And,
Right.
and to beat Michigan, which they didn't do. And so, yeah, but you look at that team, and the question is not, can they win it if they play that way? It's, can they play that way for 3 more games in a
Agreed.
row? Because that same motivation after what they just did, it's going to be tough to reach back down and find that again and then again.
I don't disagree with you there, except I would say this. I think Michigan loss aside, which is an astonishing clunker on every level. Game planning, execution, clearly super tight, much better, more talented than that Michigan team at home. I mean, that loss aside, I think they pretty much were a lot of the year that team that we saw the other night. They pretty much were that team. I think they played really, really well in Eugene. If you think back to that game, if Will Howard slides a beat earlier,
they ran out of time.
And that happens. Oregon won. Oregon played really well. Oregon also was at home. Yeah. And Oregon's done everything it ought to do, and we'll see what happens. I actually think, here's what I'm saying. This is true for Oregon, which would have to play 1 fewer game. It's also true for Ohio State. I think, assuming it doesn't get banged up, the winner of that game, the Rose Bowl, is my national champion. That's what I think. Yeah. And that means Ohio State, if they beat Oregon, I'm going to ride them. Now, boy, that puts me out on a limb. Not really, but I am. But I think what we saw against Tennessee, that's the team. And they don't have to play to that level, but if they can play to 85, 90% of that level, they're going to beat most of these teams out here.
Yeah, and George, go into the question you asked, the other part of it, which is how many of these teams that won in the first round do you think can win it all? I mean, I'm inclined to say, what Paul said, which is I'm skeptical of Penn State because they've lost so many games in a row against top 5 teams, and ultimately they're going to have to beat 1 or 2 top 5 teams in order to, probably at least 2, right, in order to get to the national championship and win it. But you look at the draw, and considering Georgia's quarterback situation, is it all that crazy? I think the initial feeling is that this is kind of a toss-up game, Notre Dame, Georgia. And I don't have a problem seeing Notre Dame win this game. If they do, Penn State is supposed to beat Boise State. Would it be an upset for Penn State to beat Notre Dame? No. And so whether it's Penn State or Notre Dame, either one that ends up in the national championship game, in a one-game scenario, either of those teams is talented enough. While they might not be as talented as an Ohio State or an Oregon or a Texas on the other side, in a one-game scenario, they can absolutely win it. And so I have a hard time sitting here right now and saying that there's any one of those 4 teams that I don't think could ultimately be the national champion because of Georgia's quarterback situation and how that affects I think it's the bottom half of the bracket, the way that we normally look at it. So, hey, one other thing I just want to say before we move on and do our picks for this week, just looking back on the first round and a lot of the conversation we talked about early as far as, fans were just upset that there were no competitive games, right? And they voiced that in different ways. This team shouldn't have been there. That team, however you want to express it. I think a source of the frustration is that all those years of watching these non-competitive semifinals and then sometimes championship games in the 4-team playoff, one of the things that most of us felt like is, okay, if we expand, this is where we're finally going to get some competitive games, right? It's like when we get the 8 versus 9 and the 7 versus 10, we may end up with the same mess once we get to the semifinals, but at least the early rounds will be fun. And I think there was just a lot of frustration from people that we didn't get that, at least not in the first round. I will be surprised if we don't get at least one good one in the quarterfinals. But, I mean, you look at, look, the odds makers are wrong a lot. But the odds makers are telling us that 2 of the 4 games are not supposed to be close. And that would be the Boise State game and the Arizona State game. And could both of those be blowouts? I wouldn't be surprised. But I would be surprised if at least one of the other 2 games isn't really fun to watch and doesn't go the full 4 quarters. But if it doesn't, maybe we'll have another round of people trying to find a reason to get upset about what the selection committee did.
And we'll talk more about those matchups. The Fiesta Bowl is set for New Year's Eve, Penn State, Boise State. The Peach Rose and Sugar all set for New Year's Day. Texas, Arizona State, Ohio State, Oregon, and Notre Dame, Georgia, respectively. Talk a lot about those in next week's episode as we preview them. But I'm just, you're right. They weren't great games, but it was a great spectacle. And I'm glad that college football, I'd probably be happy with an 8-team playoff, but I'm glad to see college football on campus in postseason. How do I reconcile that with my love for the bowls? I don't know. It doesn't have to be logical here. But I think we need to move ahead to our picks. We're going to pick 3 bowl games this week. Speaking of bowl games, but before we do, I need to tell you that we're thankful to be sponsored. This segment, our pick segment, sponsored by the Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor's George Truett Theological Seminary. Think deep, lead strong, run the race well. The Faith and Sports Institute is a team of athletes, coaches, chaplains, and scholars who provide theological education, compelling research, and formative practices for Christian leaders in sports. They've got graduate degree programs, online certificate programs, and a Master of Arts in Theology and Sports Studies online. As far as I can tell, that is a unique degree in religious education, probably anywhere, but certainly in the United States. And speaking of the scholars who provide theological education, as I said at the top of the podcast, we're joined by Dr. Paul Putz, who is the director of the Faith and Sports Institute and is one of those scholars. So appreciate you joining us. And now we're going to find out if you know anything about picking football games.
Yeah, we'll see if that translates. I did grow up Pentecostal, say that, but never was identified with the gift of prophecy. So I don't feel great about the prediction element.
Well, that's good because we don't either. But especially especially this week, it's bowl games. It's what we would all consider, except for Nebraska fans, to be minor bowls. And so, if any, it's hard to sort of even wrap your mind around who's going to play, what the motivation is going to be. It used to be who wants to be there, who doesn't want to be there, right? Now it's who's even going to be there in terms of on your roster. And it's so hard to know that. Please take this with a grain of salt. This is entertainment purposes only for y'all, right? You guys understand this. But we're going to pick the Las Vegas Bowl, which is Texas A&M versus USC. We're going to pick the Alamo Bowl, BYU, Colorado, and the Pinstripe Bowl, Boston College, Nebraska. Those are on, let's see, I don't get my days right, Friday the 27th and Saturday the 28th. And so let's start with the Vegas Bowl, Texas A&M, USC. Paul, Brad, what do you guys think?
Well, look, Texas A&M took Nebraska's athletic director. Trev Alberts ditched us. He's an alum of Nebraska and brought in Matt Rule and then headed down to the Aggies. So out of pure spite, I feel like I need to go with USC, even though I've seen USC has lost some transfers and I don't necessarily feel great about this, but I'm going USC over A&M for that bowl game.
I'm going to go the other way because I don't have any spite toward Trev Alberts, who I actually worked with for a few years at ESPN.
Great person, I'm sure.
that aside, I love Trev. That aside, look, there's a lot more unrest in the USC program right now than there is in the A&M program. And on top of it, if you watched USC play outside of the Coliseum much this season, you would have a hard time picking them to win a game outside of the Coliseum. And this game's obviously much closer to USC than it is to Texas A&M being in Vegas. I'm not so sure there are going to be a lot of USC fans there. But this is not USC on its home field, and I've got to go with A&M.
Yeah, listen, I'm not high on either team here. Not high on either team at all. But I do think Texas A&M has probably a better chance of sort of coalescing than USC does. And so I'm going to go with the Aggies as well. Paul, you're in Texas. If I can put you together with Trev, maybe we can kind of heal these hurts at some point.
A little reconciliation.
Yeah, too soon maybe, but one of these days.
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah, set us up. And it's like we said earlier, it's all football, nothing personal, all football.
Let me tell you, the other reason I'm picking Texas A&M is because if I didn't, about 3/4 of our church membership would revolt and go down the street somewhere else. We got a bunch of Aggies here.
There's always more to the
know
story.
your culture. Know your
That's
culture.
Right.
Yep.
So, all right, the Alamo Bowl, BYU, Colorado. I'll go, Brad, you go, and then Paul, you go after that. Listen. This is the game that the Big 12 would have liked to have seen for its conference championship matchup. first of all. And we talked about Colorado earlier, and we said that was, had they gotten into the conference championship game and won their way into the college football playoff, it would have been a ton of fun. I agree, Paul. You're right about that. I also think that BYU is a pretty darn good football team that hadn't got a lot of love for some reason. Went 10-2 this year. This has a chance to be a really good game. I think Shedeur and Travis, who are going to play despite the opt-out thing because of their relationship with Dion, I think they win it. So I'm going to go with Colorado in the Alamo Bowl over BYU.
This is a tough one, and this is fun because, George, as you mentioned, they are both Big 12 teams. It's very, very rare to see teams from the same conference playing each other in a bowl game. But I have a feeling I'm not going to say it's going to become common, but it might not be something that we don't see at least once every couple of years, just because it is going to be common for there to be good teams in these conferences that didn't play each other in the regular season. And so I think it maybe creates more motivation, to be ready to play if it is a team from your own league. So kind of fascinated to see whether this becomes more normal. But I'm going to go with BYU just because I like them better on the lines of scrimmage. Certainly the fact that Colorado's stars are playing in the game is unexpected for where we are in college football right now, and that's awesome that they're doing it. But I'm going to go with the Cougars to win this Big 12 matchup here in the Alamo Bowl.
Yeah, and real quick, the reason that they're doing that is because the Alamo had a tie-in with the Pac-12, and so they were going to take a Pac-12 team, and there weren't sort of non-Big 12 teams available, and so they were going to take a former Pac-12 team. So, but USC wasn't good enough to be there, for example, and so I mean, quite literally, that's kind of how that worked out. But I do agree, we're going to see more of that. So, Paul, BYU, Colorado in the Alamo Bowl.
I think I'm going to go with BYU, but some background on this, and a team that George and I both root for and follow closely, the Baylor Bears. Want to give them a shout out and the turnaround that they had this season. Big fan of Coach Aranda, seeing them finish 8-4, seeing them battle both of these teams, BYU and Colorado. Almost had to come back against BYU right on the cusp of a big win there. And then against Colorado had that devastating loss where they last pass of the game beat in Boulder. I remember watching that. It's 11:30 at night, and just that loss was a tough one. So, both of these teams with Colorado and BYU, you mentioned BYU on the lines. Colorado can score so quickly. It's how they came back against Baylor and impress in different ways, but also have some real weaknesses in different ways. I'm going BYU though. Brad, you mentioned the lines. The other thing is with Shedeur and Travis Hunter, who I'm glad to see them playing. There's just a part of me that thinks these are like top 5 NFL draft picks, right? Like they're going to play, but how much are they really investing in this bowl game compared to BYU, who they don't have the NFL pedigree? So I think I'm going to go BYU, but I am excited to see those guys out there again because they've been a lot of fun for college football. And I'm also excited to see what's next for Colorado. And I know they have some good recruits coming in. So they're a great storyline that I'm looking forward to following. But just don't beat Baylor next year on a last-second pass. That's my one request.
Why you got to go bringing that up again, Paul? Come on, man. There had been healing occurring. No. So that's good. So you guys both have BYU. I have Colorado. We can come back and laugh at each other later. So Pinstripe Bowl, Boston College and Nebraska. The Huskers make their first trip in 7 years. Is that right?
7 years. I have a son who's in first grade who has never been alive for a Nebraska bowl game, which is absolutely crazy to think about. Like there is no other Power 4 team who's had that long of a bowl streak. You can name it: Kansas, Vanderbilt, go on down the line, Duke, Northwestern, all of those teams have played in bowl games. Nebraska hasn't. As a kid growing up in the mid-'90s, if you would have told me this would be Nebraska football, and yet we're selling out every single game, every single year, and the fan base is still on board, it's remarkable. So, real excited that we're back in a bowl game, even though we wish it was a better one.
For sure. Listen, I don't know the first thing about Boston College. I only know a little bit about Nebraska. I don't know who's playing and who's not playing. I'm just going to let you guys know that right up top. But for Paul, I'm going to take Nebraska. There's no place like Nebraska, so I'm taking Nebraska.
We go Big Red.
Brad has researched both teams extensively. He has a good feel for this game. And Brad,
Well,
what do you think?
so yeah, I spent 5 minutes researching them, so I can tell you a little bit about this. My instinct was to take Nebraska because I knew that Boston College had made a quarterback change during the season, and I didn't realize that it actually had gone fairly well. So after changing quarterbacks, BC ended up winning 3 of its last 4 games, which those wins were against Syracuse. The one loss was by 10 points at SMU. So this team closed the season pretty well. Grayson James is the new quarterback. Looking at this, I feel like BC is probably going in maybe more excited than Nebraska. I mean, possibly not, just because you mentioned it's been a while since Nebraska, even though the 6-6 season was disappointed, maybe they are excited to be there as well. But I think Boston College cares. With that said, looking at who they have wins over, especially late in the season, I'm going to go with BC here to knock off Nebraska.
All right. And Paul.
And I like Trev Alberts too.
Mm-hmm.
Nebraska fans. There you go.
That's right. That's right.
Paul, you get the pick. Pinstripe Bowl, Boston College or Nebraska?
Got to go Huskers, of course. I do think Boston College is a tough team, well coached, and it's not going to be an easy game. I think with Nebraska, a lot of their guys are playing. They've got Ty Robinson. They've got Nash Hutmaker, who they're big defensive linemen who are seniors who might have opted out if they, in previous years, or if Nebraska was routinely going to bowl games. But it means a lot to the seniors for Nebraska because they've been trying to do this for 4 years. They finally got it. So I think that extra incentive means a lot of their guys are going to be invested in playing. You got Dana Holgerson running the offense now. Nebraska did turn a bit of a corner there the last 3 games. They looked sharper, more efficient on offense when he was calling the plays. And I like, Dylan Raiola, more seasoning, more time with the offense. So I'm going to go Nebraska. I do think it's going to be a close fought one, but hopefully we'll come out with the W.
All right, that's good. We've got some disagreement on the picks, which is always fun. And so we'll see how that works out. But that will do it for our pick segment. And we want to say thanks again to the Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor's Truett Seminary for sponsoring this pick segment. And we will talk about that some more in the second half when we come back and discuss faith, as we always do after our break. So it's time to get to the half, and we'll be right back.
The Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor's Truett Seminary is a place where Christian leaders in sports are formed and equipped through theological education, practical training, and useful resources. As a sports ministry leader, coach, athlete, pastor, or student who wants to learn more, you can apply for admission in an online or residential graduate degree program, take continuing education certificate classes, and participate in character and leadership practicums. Start your journey at baylor.edu/truett/FSI. Think deep, lead strong, and run the race well with the Faith and Sports Institute today.
All right, welcome back to the second half of Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast. This is the half where we talk about our faith in Jesus. This is the part that, I love the most. And we always start it out. And by the way, I'm George Schroeder. He's Brad Edwards. And we're joined again by Dr. Paul Putz from Baylor's Truett Seminary, the Faith and Sports Institute. He's the director there. But we always start this second half out with what is actually my favorite segment. It's called On My Heart. We talk about whatever the Lord has laid on our hearts here recently. And we kind of go back and forth. And this week, Brad's going to share what I think is a special Christmas edition of On My Heart. Brad, what's on your heart?
Yeah, so George, as everybody knows, the real reason that we celebrate Christmas is because of what God did for all of us by sending Jesus to be a human and live among us, live a life as we did, but do it without sin, so that he would be able to be the perfect sacrifice for our sins, and obviously that gift is what is celebrated. So it's basically God's grace and God's love are the reason that we celebrate Christmas. But one thing that I want to point out, which is on my heart after kind of going through the Christmas story in both Matthew and Luke with our high schoolers, is also the element of faith that I think a lot of times gets lost within this story. And specifically the faith of both Mary and Joseph. And so looking at Luke chapter 1, I think most people know the story where the angel Gabriel appears to Mary and basically explains to her what is going to happen. And just picking it up in verse 30, and the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." And Mary said to the angel, "How will this be, since I am a virgin?" The angel answered her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And behold, your relative Elizabeth in her old age has conceived a son, and this is the 6th month with her who was called barren, for nothing will be impossible with God." And then this is the part I want to focus on. And Mary said, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." And the angel departed from her. Okay, and I think in our culture today, we often miss the significance of what it is that Mary is doing here and what she is accepting on faith, because she is going to become pregnant at a time when she is betrothed but not yet officially married, which is, according to Jewish law, that's a no-no. And I think in an area that is pretty small where they lived, where everyone would have known everyone, it's kind of hard to conceal a pregnancy, even with the type of clothing they wore back then. So this is something that had to be frightening to Mary to a certain extent, and yet you can see here, at least as far as what shared with us, that she really doesn't hesitate and says that that she will serve the Lord, and that that she has the faith to go through with this. And I know some people might say, well, look, if an angel appeared to me, then that alone would convince me I need to do this. That might sound logical, and maybe it would be to some people. But earlier in this chapter, we see the incident where the angel of the Lord appears to Zechariah, and this is regarding the birth of John the Baptist. Zechariah, who is a priest, by the way, and the angel appears to him in the temple, and yet he is not totally convinced, and he's doubtful about the message that his wife, who is believed to be barren, is going to have a son. And so because of his doubt, there's kind of a waiting period for Zechariah. But I just wanted to point that out, which is that here you have a guy who is a priest who is seeing an angel beside the altar, and yet he doesn't immediately show the faith that Mary does. And so I think it's kind of wrong for us to look at this story and say, well, that's a given if you have that type of revelation, that you're just going to go with it. And then the other thing that I wanted to look at is the reaction of Joseph. Mm-hmm. When Joseph the angel of the Lord appears to Joseph in a dream, and this is in Matthew chapter 1. It is a very similar episode, and Joseph is told that his wife, who is pregnant, and he knows she's pregnant, that this child is born of the Holy Spirit. And I'm trying to imagine attempting to grasp that, right? Like, I know we've heard this story so many times that it's just like, oh yeah, okay, conceived by the Holy Spirit. But if your wife is pregnant and you know she's never been with you, and
you're not your wife even, right?
You're right. Not even your wife,
Yep.
betrothed. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you're being told this. This is a tough thing to accept. And once again, okay, you're talking about the angel of the Lord, but it is a dream, right? And now I've got to believe that, I've never had the angel of the Lord appear to me in a dream. And I'm assuming you guys haven't either. I would guess that it's something that is unmistakable, that it's not like, well, that was a weird dream. You know that it was a real thing. But at the same time, I don't know that this is the type of thing that every one of us would have said, okay, that makes sense, I'm going to do this. But that's what Joseph does. And that Joseph takes it on faith that this is what God wants him to do. And he stays with Mary. He does not divorce her, and obviously stays with her all the way through the birth of Jesus. And we don't know how much longer from that point that Joseph is still there. He obviously disappears from the picture at some point, and most scholars assume that he died at some point during Jesus's childhood or early adulthood. But yeah, I wanted to share that just because I think that's something that is often missed, is just the faith that is shown by both Mary and Joseph when they are presented with what is going to happen with the birth of Jesus. and the role that each of them is supposed to play in this, and that this is a very difficult position to be in, especially when you understand their culture. And the fact that they went with it and they had the faith to do it, I think is a just kind of a underplayed element of the story, and it's something that obviously every one of us, should try to emulate. And yeah, I don't know when the last time was that each of us or anyone listening kind of felt that God was calling them to do something, and how often that we have said, "Okay, God, I'm ready," but it's not an easy thing to do in all circumstances, and you see that here as part of the Christmas story. And I just wanted to point that out, and that's really what's kind of on my heart right now as I look at this, is taking away more from this story than just what God did for us, but the example of faith that is shown through these two important characters in this story that I think is so often overlooked.
Yeah, man, I love that. You mentioned Joseph's response. And, first of all, it says Mary was engaged to Joseph, and you used the word betrothed. And it was a lot more than what we know as of engagement.
Right.
It was betrothal was essentially pretty close to married. It was somewhere between engagement and marriage as we know it. And it says, and you mentioned that Joseph didn't divorce her, because that's what it would have been had he broken off the engagement, right? It would have been like, if we decide to break off an engagement, it's just like, well, they're no longer engaged. It was a bigger deal. It says it was discovered after they were engaged that she was pregnant from the Holy Spirit. So Joseph, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her publicly, decided to divorce her secretly. So he was going to do the right thing because he had no idea what was going on. But even then, he was going to try to do it kindly.
Yeah.
So I love his character there. But it was the thing to do too, because at that point, your wife or your wife to be, you think, has cheated on you, right?
And by the way, let me just insert, and I know you guys know this, but according to Jewish law, Mary technically could be stoned to death for that.
Yep.
Like this was not I don't know how common it would have been in that day to carry out that punishment, but according to the law, that's what could have happened. So this is a big deal.
And then the angel comes to him in a dream, and he says, "Yep, let's do it," just like Mary did. I love the fact that you brought out that the parents of Jesus had to accept on faith. And also that meant they had to accept some ridicule and because I'm sure people thought it was them, right? And that was a big deal that we can't understand. And you've sort of brought out some of that here just now. So thank you for bringing that out. Paul, anything strike you about what's on Brad's heart?
I just love that idea of the example of faith. And I was thinking of Hebrews 11 and 12 as you were talking, and that beautiful passage, which ends in Hebrews 12, that talks about setting our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. But before it gets to that, it just lists example after example of people who by faith trusted in God. And it's easy for us, we look back on the Christmas story, and it's such a part of, for us in the United States, as a part of our culture. And so it can become almost, we don't think deeply about it. And yet to think about people who, they aren't looking back, they're looking forward, and they're trusting, not knowing fully what's going to happen, but that God is going to do something. And they're trusting in that, not seeing in full, but to put their faith in God. I think for us, that's a good example, because we also are people who live by hope. Yes, we know that Jesus came. We know that he lived, died, and rose again, but we believe he's coming again. And we don't know exactly when that is, but we by faith live into that. So I love that as a message for us, just ordinary Christians doing our best in the day-to-day. And that's really who Mary and Joseph were. So yeah, really, really good perspective, Brad.
God is trustworthy. And, while we're here for Christmas, I just want to say this. We all think about, to the extent that we even think about Christmas being about Christ, in many cases, we just think about this cute little baby in a manger, right? No crying he makes. Well, look, first of all, I love that song, but he cried. Okay. That song's not theologically or historically accurate. All right. Jesus was every bit a baby, and then every bit a boy, and then every bit a man. The difference is he didn't sin, and he was sent. He was fully God and fully man. And he was sent because God loved us so much that he wanted us to be reconciled to him. And so the Bible teaches that God's holy, we're not. And so we have fallen short, and we deserve the penalty, which is death. And so instead, Jesus came to earth and went to death on a cross to pay the price for sin. And if the Bible says if you'll turn from sin and trust him, you'll be saved. That's Christmas. The manger and the cross go together. And we need to be thinking about that. Christmas and Easter are inextricably linked. And Easter, of course, we celebrate the resurrection after Jesus' death on the cross. And so my prayer for all of our listeners this week is first that you have a great Christmas, but I guess more importantly, that if you don't know this Jesus, that you come to know him. Brad and I would love to talk with you about that. If you'd like to talk with us, you can reach out to gridirongospelpod@gmail.com, or you can hit us up on X, formerly known as Twitter, at George Schroeder or at JBradEdwards. Remember, all SEC complaints go to Brad. I do want to do this while we've got Paul Putz on the episode, friend of the pod from way back. You're director of the Faith and Sports Institute at Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor. And, we've been talking about the Faith and Sports Institute over the last few weeks. I'm grateful that they would sponsor a segment on the podcast. Tell me what the Faith and Sports Institute is, and tell me the currency of it for our listeners.
Yeah, well, I should note that my picks don't necessarily reflect the perspective of the Faith and Sports Institute or Truett Seminary. So any shots fired at Aggies fans or the SEC, I'm speaking in my personal capacity. We love y'all at the Faith and Sports Institute. In fact, we've got some Aggies in our program, a number of SEC grads too. So a little caveat there. So the Faith and Sports Institute,
accept them is what you're saying. Okay.
We're trying to model Christ, right?
Wow.
Come one, come all.
It's a mission field.
We need each other. Mission field. That's right. So we're a center for developing and forming Christian leaders in sports, is the way we like to say it. We're unique in that we're embedded in a seminary. And so this is graduate education that focuses on theology and spiritual formation. And for us, also thinking about Christian leadership. And kind of the foundation of what we do are graduate programs. You can pursue a Master of Divinity, a Master of Arts in Christian Ministry with the sports ministry concentration, or we have a Master of Arts in Theology and Sports Studies, which is available in an online setup. And then we have some continuing education programs as well. And the whole goal of all of our education, all of our programs, all of our initiatives, it is to connect on the ground with Christians actually engaged in sports, whether they're in sports ministry, sports chaplaincy, if you're an AD at a Christian high school or a college, or a coach, if you're a pastor who thinks and reflects on sports, there is a space for you. And we have a student who represents all of those vocations in at least one of our programs. And whatever the context is, we want to come alongside people, be a resource, equip them, develop them, help them become a part of a community and a network of Christians who are realizing just what a crucial space sports is for connecting with people and helping those people connect with God. I mean, we believe God made the world good, and that sports are part of God's good world. We believe it's broken, just like the world is broken. There's elements of brokenness in sports, but we believe it can be redeemed and restored, or at least in some ways we can experience that right now through Jesus. And we want to help Christians who are passionate about that too. So that's what we're about. And we love to connect with anyone who is also passionate about those things and interested in those things.
Can you give us just a few of the courses that people can take as part of this, that maybe some of the more popular ones that are out there that might just kind of get the wheels turning with some of the listeners here?
Yeah, we'll start with in our graduate program, we have a class called Faith and Sports Integration. And there's a residential version of this, and there's also an online version of it. The residential version is set up as a retreat, an experience where you're actually competing in sports. And while you're competing, you're learning how to cultivate Christian virtue and connect your sports experience with recognizing God's presence. This is a really, really unique experience. And last summer, we actually had Baylor athletes who went through the retreat. And then some of our students served as mentors and helped guide the experience so they could learn what does it look like to walk alongside actual, in this case, Baylor athletes, and help to teach and form and shape them and understand what does it mean, not to separate who you are as a Christian when you step onto the field of play, but to actually accept and recognize God's presence. Because he's there, whether you see him or not, he's present. So how do we live into that? So Faith Sport Integration, the residential version, very popular and a class that people love. But we also have an online version. And of course, in an online version, you can't actually go and do the retreat in person. And so instead of that embodied experience, which is so important, we encourage students to develop programs where they can try to help people in sports connect and integrate their faith with the sports experience in a realm that might not be for the athlete. So we've had students in the online version of it develop a program for people in baseball analytics to build community and to learn what does it mean to follow Christ while you're pursuing this career in stats in Major League Baseball. We've had an athletic director who developed a program to help Christian colleges form and shape the athletes who come through that program in ways that are Christ-centered. We've had someone who is an author and involved in sports ministry who used the program to develop an initiative for a church to engage in a youth sports program so that they can help parents of kids be discipled as they engage in the question of youth sports, because, man, that is an issue that I hear so much about. So the point is, there's all sorts of ways that we connect with sports. It's not just the big time, high level sports. There's all sorts of ways we do. And that class is really designed to help people see their context in sports, connect it with God's work in the world. And that's definitely a favorite. The other one I'll mention is when I teach, it's sports and Christianity in historical context. My training is as a sports historian. And so in that class, we go through 2,000 years of Christians engaging in sports. Mm-hmm. It ain't new. And 2024, there's a lot of things that are new, but the fact that Christians are talking about sports is not new. We actually now are entering into a conversation that's been going on way before we were around. And so that class is designed to help students connect our experience now with this much larger story, and then to try to apply history to the present. I mean, I wish that everyone loved to just get super academic and nerd out about history, but students don't come into our program to be historians. They come to see, how can history be practical? How can I connect history to what I'm doing right now? And so in that class, we try to help people make those connections and, again, invite them into that bigger story.
The Faith and Sports Institute is a unique thing, and it's really cool. I love that. And I'm remiss in not saying that some of the stuff that forms the fodder for your class that you just talked about is a book that you've had out for a couple of months, The Spirit of the Game, American Christianity in Big Time Sports. I've had the opportunity to read it, and y'all, I did not have my hard copy with me, so I'm just showing it to you. That those of you on the YouTube channel can see it, right? So, sort of. It is worth your time. You can find it on Amazon or all the booksellers. The Spirit of the Game, American Christianity and Big Time Sports by Paul Emery Putz. It's a fascinating read from a historian. And so there are no punches pulled. There's a lot of fascinating stuff I didn't realize about the development of sports and the integration of and the embrace of and the standoffishness of Christians with sports. And I really loved once we got into kind of the 20th century, but what you talked about, the 2,000 years coming all the way up to now, is an amazing thing to note. Some of the same issues we're talking about now were issues in the first century, believe it or not. And so it's fascinating. I would encourage you guys to pick it up. It's really good. And Paul, I have appreciated the opportunity to read it. So it's really good.
Thanks, George. I appreciate that.
I also appreciate you joining us. It's been fun, and I'm glad you joined us. Sometimes we have people join us for the first half and the second half, or the second half, but to have somebody do both and is fun too. So, but we do have to go. We've taken a little more time than we wanted to on a Christmas week, but everybody's off work. You've got time. So
that's right.
That's right. While you're wrapping presents, give this a listen,
That's right. And wrap up one of those books. Probably Amazon Prime can get it to you pretty quick. So, hey, you can, if you're just listening to us and you heard me referencing the YouTube channel, if you go to YouTube and search for Gridiron and the Gospel, you'll find it. This week's a good one because Paul's on here. Other weeks it's just us, and you've seen our pictures before. You've seen all you want. You can visit us online at gridironandthegospel.com. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at gridiron_gospel.
And you can reach out to us on X, or if you still want to call it Twitter, whatever your preference. Yeah. He is at George Schroeder, and I am at J. Brad Edwards. And it could be compliments, complaints, questions, whatever you want to do. We would love to talk with you. And you could also, if you're not a social media person, you can email us at gridirongospelpod@gmail.com. And be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app. We're on all the major podcasting platforms. Just search for Gridiron and the Gospel or follow the links on our show website.
And tune in next week for more Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast.